Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Jon Hilsenrath. Jon is a senior writer for the Wall Street Journal, a former Wilson Center public policy fellow, and the author of this new book, Yellen, the Trailblazing Economist Who Navigated an Era of Upheaval. Welcome, Jon. Terrific piece of work.
Thank you for having me, John, and I want to thank the Wilson Center for all the support it gave me in producing the book. I was a fellow there during the pandemic. It was an unusual time, but the support I got was critical to making this project happen.
I guess great to get away from the deadlines and actually be able to focus for a period of time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Day-to-day deadlines on a newspaper in a very eventful, tumultuous time in our nation's history. So it was good to break away for a couple of months and really focus on getting this book done.
So, there's a lot of things you can write about, a lot of people you could write about. It's not as if Janet Yellen is obscure, clearly a historic figure, having held three posts that no one else, the Fed chair, the Treasury Secretary, the chair of the Council of White House Economic Advisors. So, you don't have to explain why you would choose Janet Yellen, other than the fact that you could choose all kinds of subjects.
Yeah.
When did it first occur to you that this was a book you needed to write?
The funny answer to that question is it occurred to me at a time and a place when many people get their inspiration. I was actually in the shower. You mentioned her resume. It was clear to me after President-elect Biden asked her to be the Treasury Secretary that this was the RBG, so to speak, of economics, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg of economics. I'd covered Yellen for many years. And what struck me in that moment, as I was thinking about her story, is that was her family, really, and a love story that kind of underlay her own career. She's married to a Nobel Prize winning economist, George Akerlof, who really shaped the way people think about economics. And it occurred to me that between the two of them, between Janet Yellen and her husband, George Akerlof, they really tell a story of modern economics itself. And so what I set out to do was to use them really as the central characters in a bigger story about the modern era of modern economic upheaval. So this is a biography, but it's also a story where she and her husband are central characters in a much bigger drama of the U.S. economy.
And it really is a dual biography. I mean, the Janet Yellen gets the masthead, but it's almost equally about both of them.
Right. And my original title for the book was actually Janet and George. We had a lot of conversations about that with my publisher, and they felt as you read the book, Yellen really kind of emerges as the star of the show. And because she's such an important historic figure, because she's had so many important policymaking roles and also happens to have been a woman who broke through many glass ceilings, we thought that we should shine a little bit more of a light on her in billboarding this story. But it really is a story about the two of them, George Akerlof and Janet Yellen. And the two are kind of central to each other's careers. And their family life really kind of underlies everything that they've accomplished, because they forged a full and equal partnership in work and family that really drove the two of them.
Yeah, I guess an alternate title could have been Sweetie and Weedy, based on the nicknames that you reveal in the book.
Hey, maybe we'll make that the documentary. I appreciate that. We'll give you credit.
I'm always interested to see how an author or a filmmaker nails the landing, right? What is the last thing that you choose to put in the book? And because you mentioned the love story, I'll fast forward to the end. You tell what I read it as a sweet story about Janet helping George find his phone.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What I was going to say is, do you find you said it's a love story. Did you kind of fall in love with the romance between these two?
I mean, I'm a human like anybody else, and I thought that was a really kind of nice narrative thread. So I'll set the scene. I was actually out visiting the two of them in their home in Berkeley, California, in August of 2021, and it was during the botched American pullout from Afghanistan. It was a very chaotic time. She was very stressed out, not just about that, but about the risk that there would be a debt ceiling crisis and a confrontation between Republicans and Democrats in Congress, that they wouldn't raise the debt ceiling and that we would have a financial crisis later in the year. She was very stressed out. And, a lot of this story is about economic upheaval. And like there's a lot of really disturbing stories about the American economy in this book. And I'm sitting there kind of with the two of them, and I'm talking to the Treasury Secretary Yellen, and George wanders into the room. He is the quintessential absent-minded professor, and he wanders into the room just kind of looking lost. And Secretary Yellen, Janet, turns to him and said, what's the matter, sweetie? And he's, what he kind of says in his kind of absent-minded way, well, I can't seem to find my phone. And she says, okay, why don't I call it? And then you can see if you can hear where it is. And, it's, I've had that conversation, in my own family before. I think we all have. And it was just kind of such a sweet moment. And, and she calls his phone and he wanders into another room and he's like, I found it. And it just felt like a nice way to end what's a pretty kind of disturbing story about the American economy, that these are kind of two people doing their best, trying to find answers that are often very elusive. And in the case of their own life, the one small unit of their family, they found a way to kind of make a consequential life out of their own work and family.
Yeah, well, it works tremendously, and the understatement in which you tell the story makes it even that much more effective, I think. The what you just said about the fact that these are just people trying to do their best under trying circumstances. On the book jacket, there's the quote about Hilsenrath reminds us that economics is neither science nor ideology, and someone's wished or promised economics as someone's wished or promised, and that economics is an endeavor. And you expand on that idea within the book. Talk to us about that, because, I'll have to say that was somewhat of a paradigm shifting thought for me, in the sense of, you think of things like trickle down, or these things almost arrive in the American political scene as articles of faith, rather than just people trying to be mechanics.
Well, I mean, the book kind of retraces the story of modern economics, and science and ideology are at the kind of core of the debates, the economic debates that the profession and that our political system has had for the last 60 years. I retrace the debates between Milton Friedman of the School of Free Market Economics and James Tobin, who was Yellen's mentor, who believed that the government had a role in managing the business cycle. And there was articles of faith on both sides, that markets are best left to their own devices on the right, and that the government had a role to play on the left. And, the economics profession, too, kind of fell in love with the idea in the 1950s and 60s that it was a science, and that you can kind of model economics after the model of physics and use mathematics and scientific exploration to kind of analyze and understand how economies work, how economic systems work, how markets work. And I think the story of Janet Yellen and George Akerlof really is that, underneath this system of economics that we built our kind of institutions and our prosperity around, are humans. Akerlof spent a lot of his career demonstrating that markets don't work with the exquisite precision that that economists once expected, because humans behave in ways that are unexpected. Well, I think Yellen's career demonstrates, for better and worse, that some of the same foibles that plague markets, some of the same human foibles that plague markets, also plague the policy-making arena. And that to understand how to make a better economic system and better political system, you have to understand human nature and how that interacts in these larger institutional settings of, market dynamics and political dynamics. And, this comes around to one of the bigger lessons I drew from reporting out this book, which is that these two systems, the democratic political system that we've built and the market economic system that we've built, are imperfect. And I think what the story documents is, in 1999, 2000, we came into this new millennium. By that I mean the United States, with a sense that we had built this kind of perfect system of market-driven capitalism, married to democratic governance. We thought China and Russia were going to follow our lead and that path. And what we've discovered in the last 2 decades is that a market-driven democratic capitalist system is not inevitable, and it's not easy. And it requires constant work at fixing the institutions that hold these two fragile systems together. In Russia and China, they haven't worked well together. In the United States, we've seen that markets and democracy sometimes fail us, and we have to be constantly working at upgrading and fixing the institutions that hold it together, and the people underneath it, and the trust that we have in those institutions.
Thus the notion of an endeavor that needs constant tinkering and can't just be,
Absolutely.
this is what I believe. But speaking about what Janet Yellen believes, I'm wondering, you mentioned James Tobin and his role in her life. And it's in one of the chapters where you're writing about Tobin, where this notion of moral passion emerges. What are the qualities, the belief structures, the experiences that you think made her most effective? And is this notion of moral passion sort of a headline defining characteristic?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that there are three central characteristics and three people who shaped them for her. So the first was her mother. I go into great detail in the first couple of chapters about the influence that her mother had on her. Her mother was a very demanding person who insisted that she and her brother John get all their homework done when they were children, not just they finish it, but that it be correct. They weren't to turn in their homework with mistakes on it. And so she was always a person who did her homework and was almost frankly neurotic about it. And this became an important tool for her rising in the field of economics, which was male dominated, not very friendly to women. And she was always the most prepared person in the room. Everyone agrees on that. So the other important influence was her father, who really taught her to have a sense of heart, that people suffer when they lose jobs. And he was a doctor, and he talked about his patients and the effects, the kind of emotional and family strife that was caused when people lost jobs. And he was just kind of a sweet, good-natured man, and he kind of taught her how to laugh. And then was her mentor. Finally, this is the moral passion part. Her mentor at Yale when she was getting her PhD was James Tobin, a Nobel Prize winning economist and advisor to John F. Kennedy. And he had this sense of moral passion. He had this sense that economics, which was his craft, which was something that could be used to improve human lives. It wasn't just a bunch of numbers. It wasn't just about a bunch of models on a Greek letters on a piece of paper. Underlying it, you were talking about human lives, and his purpose was to use this set of tools, that he had studied as an economist, to improve human lives. It's interesting because there were these great debates in the 1960s and 1970s between Tobin and Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman had the exact same objective of improving human lives, but he thought liberty and free markets were the best tool to do that. And Tobin thought that the government couldn't just be kind of erased out of that story. And so that they had great debates, and Yellen kind of picked up the baton from Tobin, and she felt a sense of moral passion that the government has a role to play in managing the business cycle and interacting with markets to improve the human lot. I mean, that's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is where you put this moral passion to work in an actual marketplace, and it's hard. And we've discovered that with this latest outbreak of inflation, the government, the Federal Reserve, the Trump administration, the Biden administration threw a lot of relief at this economy during COVID with the sense that they were, trying to help people through a terrible moment of turmoil. Well, it turns out they threw too much relief at it and they caused inflation. So all the models, all the formulas, all the science, all the math doesn't always predict or guarantee the ideal outcome.
You just described many of the people who shaped who Janet Yellen became. The generational theory says also the not as close to home events that we live through, whether it's a Great Depression, an attack on Pearl Harbor, 9/11, also shape our worldview. What were the generational events that she lived through that had the most impact on her thinking?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say the Great Depression shaped her childhood. So she sat around the table in her home in Brooklyn, and her father and mother told stories about people they had known or family that were suffered during the Great Depression. But I'm going to refer here actually to my mother, who was a historian of ancient Jewish history, and she came up with her own theory that she called a kaleidoscope view of history, which is that when you look in a kaleidoscope, the scene is constantly shifting, it's constantly turning, and there are pieces of the moment you're in right now that kind of unfold into the next moment and shape the next moment that you're in. And as I was writing this story, like what I felt was a sense of really dynamic history, and a sense that the Great Depression shaped the debates of the 1950s and 1960s of the role that government should play in the economy. But then we had an inflation, and that shaped another generation in the 70s and 80s. And it gave birth to a rise of a group of economists called the New Keynesians. And then we've had these succession of financial crises over the last few years. And that really shaped how policymakers responded to the COVID crisis. So the kaleidoscope is always turning, and we're constantly attaching lessons from recent events to how we should deal with crisis moments today. And I think it's one of the big challenges, which is that you can overlearn some recent history and apply it too aggressively to the moment you're in now. And make some new set of mistakes. What Yellen said to me was that the lesson she had learned from all these years on the job was that, kind of ideology and moral conviction and all these things matter, but really to be a good policymaker, and I would say to be a good investor and a good human, you have to look at the facts on the ground. And kind of what are you experiencing today? What lessons can you draw from history? But how do these facts configure to shape the moment you're in, and to kind of lead you towards finding the best way out of it?
Yeah, what you describe is essentially trying to learn the lessons of history in real time is a very heavy lift.
And also keep them in perspective, because
Right.
what happened, I think, with the inflation of 2021 and 2022 was that policymakers learned the lessons from the post financial crisis period, after the 2008 financial crisis, when unemployment was very high in the United States and other countries. Inflation was exceptionally low in the United States and other countries. Interest rates were exceptionally low in the United States and other countries. And so there was a sense in Washington that that policymakers could and should throw a lot at the shutdown problem caused by COVID to get Americans through it. And those lessons it turned out didn't all apply to the moment that we found ourselves in.
When you look at the totality of what she's done, and the story isn't over, obviously, right? She
Yeah.
still has a job. this notion of navigating these uncharted waters in roles as a regulator, as a advisor, as a manager. Uh, what's the scorecard say with where we are in the story today? How has she done?
You know, that's another good question, and it's a challenging question. Some people, you know, she has been the policymaker kind of on the bridge of the ship for the last 30 years, so to speak, the economic policymaker through all this upheaval. And there are people who will say, well, she deserves part of the blame since she was, you know, kind of steering the ship through all of this. You know, I think she had some good moments and some not so good moments. After the financial crisis of 2008, when she was literally pounding the table to get the Federal Reserve to behave aggressively, I think she gets pretty good marks. The Fed designed policies that, you know, helped to get unemployment back below 4%. It took too long, but it happened while inflation was very low. And she really helped to design a lot of those policies. So give her an A on that. But she can't be left off the hook for the inflation we're experiencing today. And I think this is one of her great frustrations. This was a straight A student. The only B she ever got in her life was in a German class she took at Brown as an undergraduate. Everything else was a high A. And I think she's kind of right now in this kind of twilight of her career, very frustrated that, you know, she's now managing a situation of inflation that haunted so many economists after the 1970s, and it's back on their hands. And I think she wants to get out from under that. But the kaleidoscope turns, and there's going to be another challenge that grows out of this.
Yeah, I love your mom's kaleidoscope. I will use that in my own thinking. So,
Thank you.
beyond your protagonists, that big meta story about just the evolution of economic thought over time that the book also covers, where are we on that today, Jon? You know, what would be the defining ideology? And I know it's not an ideology, or at least the philosophy perhaps is a better word. You know, is it this identity economics, the reds versus greens that Akerlof introduces? What would be sort
Yeah.
of the dominant paradigm?
Well, so let me mention the Reds versus Greens first, since you raise it. So Akerlof is a really interesting guy. He seems to always be onto some issue decades before everybody else gets onto it. So he started studying this idea of identity in the late 1990s. And the idea is that, you know, in economics, economists tend to think of individuals as the drivers of market behavior, almost as like the atom is to physics, the individual is to market behavior. People think, you know, see what's in their own self-interest, and they try to maximize their returns on their education or their work or their investment in stocks. Well, Akerlof has always been skeptical of that, and what his view was is that no, actually, people they behave as group animals, and they identify themselves as part of groups, and so that you can't think of the individual acting in his or her self-interest outside of how an individual's, you know, thinks about, you know, their how they fit into various groups. And so he came up with this idea of reds versus greens. We've seen a long history of group behavior in which groups antagonize each other. George Akerlof's friend Amartya Sen saw this. He was another Nobel Prize winning economist. He saw this in the India that he grew up in, with Muslims and Hindus going after each other lethally. And George saw that as a problem, George Akerlof, that would define American life. And lo and behold, it does today, but not reds versus greens, which is what he had in his motto. It's reds versus blue, red America versus blue America. That's kind of really defining so much of social and economic life. I would not say that is the economic model that defines our time right now. In fact, a lot of economists haven't accepted it. I think what really strikes me is that after 2 decades of economic upheaval, we don't really have a model. I would say, I mean, I'll come back to institutions in a second, but you know, the Chicago school ruled the roost in the 1970s and 1980s. But in fact, if you look at the Chicago school today, the Chicago school itself isn't even a Chicago school anymore. There aren't it isn't driven. The University of Chicago isn't run by free market economists. A lot of economists spent the last 30 years finding flaws in the idea that free markets should be, are the kind of best system and should be left to their own devices. So, I mean, I think, you've seen these new Keynesians who've said, well, the government has some limited role to play in interacting with markets. And that idea ruled the roost, I think, for the last 20 years. But here we are with high inflation, and 2 decades of financial crisis. And I think that the government's role in navigating the economy has also come under question. So where does that leave us?
I'm sorry, please
go
continue.
ahead.
No, please continue.
Well, so just to finish this thought, I would say that what I discovered in reporting this book is that market systems are fragile and flawed, and the government interventions are fragile and flawed. And what you need is robust institutions that are trusted by the public to keep this marriage together. It's not an easy marriage, but it beats the alternative, as they say, as we've seen in Russia, autocratic government, and potentially as we see unfolding in China of autocratic interventions. This democratic capitalism is hard, and it just doesn't come naturally. I think you need robust institutions, and by that I mean a free press that people trust, electoral systems that people trust, a banking system, regulatory systems. Our founders, the founders of the United States, what they really went about doing was creating institutions, starting with the Constitution, but then growing from that, institutions that can hold the market system and the democratic system together. And I think the lesson I draw from writing this story is that we need to be working at these institutions to keep democracy and capitalism robust and functioning, and as that beacon for the world.
Wow, and all of those things you mentioned, unfortunately, teetering at this moment, right? What I was going to observe earlier, John, is that what you were saying about there not being a dominant economic system now or philosophy, I couldn't help but see the parallels with politically and in foreign policy. We've sort of been adrift since the end of the Cold War, looking for that ballast that defines the way nations interact.
Well, I mean, so in terms of the United States, the system is democratic capitalism.
Yes.
Democratic market-driven capitalism. That is the system. But, what I discovered in writing this story is that these ideological debates around that don't get you, to great answers. It can't be all markets. Like, that hasn't worked. And it obviously can't be all government or too much government. That in between these things are institutions. And, in a lot of other places, the institutions, like clearly in Russia, those institutions failed to develop and grow in a fertile way that held democratic capitalism, market-driven capitalism together. And I think the message that I walk away with from this book is that if we aren't careful in the United States, and if our policymakers and leaders of the country, not just policymakers, but business leaders and thought leaders, aren't kind of attentive to building and making robust institutions that people trust, then, there's no guarantee that our grand experiment with the system keeps working. And the people trust part is really important, because there are a lot of Americans right now who are very frustrated by 2 decades of economic upheaval, rising inequality, financial crisis, et cetera, and they're questioning the institutions that run the government, that run these systems. And that distrust happens on the right and it happens on the left. And I think maybe what needs to happen is, putting aside the ideological battles, everyone needs to say, all right, how do we rebuild trust? Like, that's what I think patriots would be doing right now, is focusing on the institutions and making them more robust, before we go down, a path that this country has avoided for more than 200 years.
Well, on that challenging and profound notion, I think that's a good place to end. I just want to say about rebuilding trust, this kind of journalism helps rebuild trust in journalism. Congratulations on a terrific piece of work, John.
I appreciate that so much. And again, I appreciate the Wilson Center. I couldn't have done this project without the Wilson Center's support. So thank you very much.
Well, we are humbled and happy to have contributed to this excellent work. Thanks.
Thank you.
We hope that you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and don't just settle for this. Read the book as well. Don't just settle for our Cliff Notes. Thanks to our guest, Jon Hilsenrath. Thanks to you for joining us. We appreciate your time and interest. For the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.